Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Esri GeoDev webinar series. We started this series as a way to continue engaging in developer-related topics and discussions in between dev summits. Along with our developer summits, we also have our annual user conference coming up July 12th through 15th. This year, we are hosting the event virtually, and we'll have an ArcGIS platform for developers track, so be sure to check it out if you do attend. Moving forward, in continuation of our GeoDev webinar series, we will have new topics, advanced features, and additional functionality to share with you. So be sure to stay connected with us through our GeoDev webinar series page or any of our social media accounts at Esri GeoDev. We would love to have conversations like these taking place throughout the year so that when we do meet at one of these Dev Summit conferences, it will be as though we never stopped. We hope you get as much or more out of this webinar than you anticipated. Now we would like to introduce you to today's webinar, Working with Custom JavaScript Functions in ArcGIS Survey123 Forms. Before we get started, I'd like to go over a few items so you know how to participate in today's event. We've taken a screenshot of an example of the attendee interface. You should see something that looks like this on your own computer desktop in the upper right corner. You're listening in using your computer's speaker system by default. However, if you would prefer to join over the phone, just select Use Telephone in the audio pane and the dial-in information will be displayed. You will have the opportunity to submit text questions to today's presenters by typing your questions into the questions pane of the control panel. You may send in your questions at any time throughout the presentation. We will collect these and address them during the Q&A session at the end of today's presentation. I would now like to introduce you to one of our presenters, Ismail. Let's get started, shall we?
Thank you, Amy. Let's get started. Today, we are going to talk about working with custom JavaScript functions in Survey123. My name is Ismael Chivite. I'm the Survey123 product manager. You can see a photo of me in action. I'm typically happy, not like in the photo. Travis, are you there?
I am, yes.
Good. Why don't you tell us a little bit about you?
My name is Travis Butcher. I work in Esri Professional Services. I do a lot of engagements with our clients around mobile and field technology. So.
Thank you, Travis. I'm sorry that I couldn't find a photo of you without someone. I don't know who this guy with the glasses is. So with that, the agenda, pretty simple, 20 minutes roughly to cover the basics. And then Travis is going to go into more advanced topics, another 20 minutes, and then we will have a live Q&A. Don't wait until the live Q&A for your questions. You can actually use the question dialog, as Amy was saying, so you can get your log of questions, and Amy is going to go through those. Even though we call this first section basic, we are going to make an assumption that you are already familiar with Survey123 XLS form and with Survey123 Connect, because working with custom JavaScript functions is in itself an advanced topic already within Survey. I will give you a little bit of context as to why you should or you shouldn't use JavaScript functions in Survey123. I will give you a demo also, so you can see how it really works, what's the syntax, what are the mechanics of it. And after that, we will go and touch more advanced topics with that. Okay, so let's get started. Why would you ever use a custom JavaScript function in ArcGIS Survey123? Well, in reality, when you are designing, as you know, in Survey123, your smart forms using the XLS form spec, you can write expressions with XLS form, and it's powerful. Now, there are, however, some situations where XLS form doesn't quite cut it. You want more flexibility. And JavaScript as a language is a little bit more difficult to learn than XLS forms, but significantly more powerful. So think of custom JavaScript functions as a complement to your XLS form formulas. You can use your custom JavaScript functions, or I should say, you can invoke your custom JavaScript functions from anywhere in your XLS form where you typically write an expression. For example, you can make a query to a feature service using JavaScript in a calculation to calculate, say, the country where a particular person person's location is. You can use maybe a custom JavaScript function to loop through values across a repeat of records and use that logic as part of a constraint to do data validation. You can maybe access a third-party API to gather live weather data from a location or to do a lookup search. And you could use that as part of a relevant statement or a calculation or a constraint. There are many workflows where you may want to use your custom logic to run your calculations, constraints, and relevant expressions. The use of custom JavaScript functions is supported in the Field app as well as the web application. So you write them once, and then you can leverage it in the Field app and the web. Here is an example. You can see on the animation on this side, we set the location of a geopoint object. We get this location, and we get the weather, the temperature, the humidity, and the feels like temperature automatically. How? With a custom JavaScript function, you can see it on the left, which invokes a third-party API. Now, if you look at the syntax here, it's just pure JavaScript, right? You pass in the latitude, the longitude, the key, in this case, for the third-party API, and then you use the XML HTTP request to make a call, a get call into the API. You pass in the parameters, you get back JSON, and then that JSON can be parsed within the XLS form to populate, as you can see, all these questions right away. Right? That's one example. Here's another one. In this case, we are using JavaScript not to hit a third-party API, but actually to access a feature service that we have. So again, we get the location, we do a pointing Polygon query, we get back JSON. So in this case, in the screenshot, I'm showing the actual JSON that I get back. Now, in reality, you don't want to expose this JSON to end users, but it's just so you can see how it works, right? The calculation of this column retrieves a JSON object, and then you can use PullData at JSON to extract attributes from that JSON to calculate things, right? You could just as well use this in a constraint. For example, you say, do a pointing Polygon. If I am not in Palm Springs, then don't let the user submit. Right? And again, this would work over the web. This would work from the Field app as well. Working with repeats. So very simple example here. I have a repeat where you can enter fruit and the quantity of fruit. If you enter the same fruit twice, then we show a message at the bottom saying, that you are repeating a fruit, right? Fruits repeated, fruits repeated. So that's part of the relevant statement. You can see it right here. PullData and JavaScript, and we will talk about this. But essentially, the relevant statement is invoking a JavaScript function. You can see it here. It's actually pretty simple. Has duplicates. You pass in an array, and then it returns true or false. That's it. That's what you want for relevant. So as you can imagine, these are types of things that you couldn't do in XLS form today. You cannot make a feature layer query with XLS form. You need JavaScript. You cannot find duplicates within a repeat with XLS form. And look, it's just one line in JavaScript. It's really, really handy. From a mechanical perspective, to invoke your own JavaScript function, you use the PullData function. Right? You say PullData. You might be familiar with PullData. We typically use it to extract values from a CSV file. Right? In this case, we are using PullData to run a JavaScript function. As I said before in one of the examples, very often, right after calling your JavaScript function, you get back a JSON object. This is particularly true when you are invoking web services. Then you can get that output and use PullData at JSON kind of parse the JSON response. And you will do that in XLS form, right? Anyways, you use PullData at JavaScript to call the function. To manage, to create, to debug your own JavaScript function, we are going to look at today at the scripts tab in Survey123 Connect. This is going to help you write your JavaScript files. And then, just for your own understanding, all the JavaScript functions are stored in the scripts folder within your survey directory. And we will see this in the demo. This is the explanation of the XLS forum sentence that invokes the JavaScript function. PullData, again. JavaScript is the first parameter. This tells PullData, hey, I want to execute a JavaScript function. Second parameter is the file that contains your function. And remember, where is this file? In the scripts folder of your survey directory. And then within this file, you are going to call this function, right? That's the function name, third parameter. And then any parameter after that is really up to your function. If your function has 3 parameters, you do parameter 1, parameter 2, parameter 3. You separate them with commas. And here you can either get data from your survey using $ curly bracket and the question name, or you can pass fixed values, like in this case, quote, parameter 2, quote. It's literally, you can pass in bananas, right? So it's just a function parameter. This will call your JavaScript function, will get back something out of your JavaScript function. In learning how to do this, my suggestion when you get, after the seminar, I would come here. New survey in Connect, samples, JavaScript. Why? Because this sample has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 examples of using JavaScript functions for different things. The classic hello world, how to do sum, how to work with a feature service, with third-party APIs, how to work with repeats. So you can learn a lot from this example just by looking at the code and the XLS syntax. Now, let me give you a quick demonstration so you can see the mechanics. I'll do this quick, so it's going to be quick, but I count on you looking at the example later and also checking some of the documentation that we're going to share with you. So I am in Connect. I'm going to say create new survey. Here I'm going to go with a, let's do a hello world V2. So let's create a survey. I just want to, we're not going to get fancy with the JavaScript logic here. I want to really describe the mechanics, the basics, the process to get this done. So let's put XLS on one side, Connect on the other side, a little bit of room. So here I'm going to say there is one question. This is the user, and then enter your name here. So let's do this, and I'm going to add node question here, and then in the node I'm going to say the label is hello, and then I'm going to get the user. Okay, so let's have a look at this. Why do I want to do this? Well, I want to do this just to make a point, which is JavaScript is powerful, but you should not use custom JavaScript functions unless you need it. Like in this case, for the hello world, I don't need a JavaScript function. I can just use this kind of question piping or dynamic label, right, in XLS form, and the work is done. So don't overcomplicate your life. There are lots of things you can do with XLS form. Now, again, for the purpose of going through the process, I'm going to do the hello world in JavaScript. But between you and I would never do it that way. I would do it like this. Anyways, so let's do a text on this. Actually, no, let's leave it like that. I'm going to do a note, okay? And then here I'm going to add a calculate question. I'm going to call this greeting. And then here I'm going to say, show me the output of greeting, right? For the note. Now I'm going to do the calculation. So here I go into the calculation. So here is where I'm going to invoke my JavaScript function, but that function doesn't exist yet. So let's work on that. So this is where the scripts thing comes into play. You see scripts at the bottom. Now, if you don't see this in Connect, it's because you have an old version of Connect. Okay, so install the latest. You click here, and then you can create a new script. So you click here, and then this is the name of the file that you're going to create. You can call it anything you like. I'm going to call it bananas and say create. So this is my file. Now, look, if I now open the survey directory, I go into files, I have a scripts folder. This is new. This was just created by Connect. And inside the scripts folder, I have bananas.js. I open this in Notepad and boom, I have my code, right? So if you change this, this will affect your form. So typically when I'm doing simple stuff, I do it here. I write my JavaScript code right here. So for example, in this case, I'm going to say my function is called greeting or greet, and then the argument one is going to be called the user. And then I'm going to say hello plus the user. Okay. And now I'm going to save it. And then I'm going to click here in select function. And this allows me to test right from here, right? So the here is going to show me all the parameters. In this case, I only have one. It's called the user. So I'm going to say Ismael. And then I click on the play button. And this gives me the output, hello, comma, Ismael. If you make a mistake here, like for example, you have a typo in the variable and then you run it, this is going to give you a message saying there is a problem here. Right? So you do this, you make sure your function works. Okay, it works. So now look at this at the bottom. There is a convenience kind of tool where you can copy to the clipboard the XLS form syntax that you can use to call your function. Right? So look, PullData at JavaScript, bananas.js, greet, the name of the function, and then the user. So I will need to replace the user, right? Obviously. So now I can get this, I copy, and then I go into my XLS file, and then I say, okay, paste that, right? So if I try this right away, it's actually not going to work, right? Because by default, we type this $, the user. This is meant to be changed, right? It says, hey, listen, I cannot replace the value of the user. So what I'm going to do here is to say, okay, that is actually the name of my question, right? It's lowercase user, the user, just like that. And now I can save it, and it should work. Okay, so now I say, Travis, hello, Travis. Simple. So let's talk about a few other things here. If you go into scripts, note that right from here, you have this option, launch external editor. You may not want to edit here. For simple stuff, it's all you need. But when you are writing more complex code, you may want to use an external IDE. In my case, I have Visual Studio Code associated with the .js files. So you can see that I can start typing Visual Studio Code. And as I make changes here, they will apply to Survey123 Connect. So literally, if I make a change here, I say bye, right? And then I save it. This is fair game as well. I come back into my form here, and then it says bye right away, right? It's like I'm going to say hola, file, and then save it, and then it triggers right away. So it's pretty simple, I guess, the way you write your functions and you access your files. Remember, in my scripts, I have the JavaScript file, go into Notepad, and I have hola. So, I mean, obviously, you're going to do more complicated things, but these are basically the mechanics. As I said before, I really love let's do the hello world v3. If you go into samples and then you search for JavaScript, this is a great place to come to learn. Why? Because it shows many different patterns, right, for using these XLS files and the JavaScript functions. And you can copy and paste, you can get inspired by this code and do also. Okay, so I want to go over some limitations. JavaScript functions are not supported in public surveys. In other words, the user going through the form needs to be logged in. Not only that, the JavaScript function will not execute if the survey is coming from another organization. So if Travis has an ArcGIS Online org, he publishes a survey, and he gives me access to that survey, but I see it in another organization, I will be able to use the form, but the JavaScript function will be disabled for security reasons. Okay. The same goes with public surveys. We disable the execution of custom JS code for security reasons. In your code, you cannot access local files. You cannot access the DOM, the document object model, because you are not running within a web browser. You are running within Survey123. And the frameworks you probably are used to that work in web browsers like jQuery, Ember, etc., they are not supported. You are not within a web browser. This doesn't mean you cannot use JavaScript libraries. That's what Travis is going to talk about, how to use Webpack to use your own libraries. And then this is not a limitation, it's really a best practice. When you are working with PullData, and this is not just for JavaScript, but PullData in general, if you are aiming for the web, do not include more than one PullData function in the same sentence, in the same expression. Just keep them separate, just like I did here in my code. You know, it's like I came into XLS form and I didn't mix things up with the node and the calculate. No, I created a calculate just to call my JavaScript function and get the output. And then I used that output somewhere else. In some cases, you may not want to store the output of these JavaScript functions, right, in the featured layer, because it's just data you use for your logic. In that case, don't be afraid of just going to the far right of the XLS file and say in the field type, you say null. And that's it. If you make this null, the JavaScript function executes, you get the value in the form, you can use it for calculations, constraints, and everything, but this value will not get stored in the data. So I like to, you know, when I do these type of things, I like to put them in gray, like that. That way I know this is like data I have in my form that will not be stored in the data. So with that, I'm going to, well, you will have this when you download the slide deck. You can go and have a look at these resources. This talks in more length about how to use JavaScript with repeats and with web services. So, you know, just go and have a look. I'm going to turn it over, Travis, to you. Are you ready?
Yes, I am.
Awesome. It's all you now.
All right. Thanks, Ishmael, for introducing us to the concepts on the JS functions. What he went over was the basic ways to be able to show these JS functions and allow them. In this section that we're going to talk about now, we're going to talk about what happens when standard just won't do. The JavaScript library that ships standard with Survey123 is limited with not a lot of libraries that you may be used to, or not a lot of functionality that exists. And so in many scenarios, we need to sort of go beyond what those standard libraries will do or allow, or more importantly, integrate complex functionality that somebody's already developed. So rather than rewrite a JavaScript function for our own needs, or even in the JS functions, we can integrate libraries that can handle some of that more complicated logic for us. So what do we do with Webpack? So Webpack allows us to take all of those additional libraries that we have available to us, and bundle them into a single function. So as Ishmael was showing, you can have a function. This allows us to bring in other libraries, bundle it into one, and include it with the Survey123. With the standard JavaScript supported, there's a lot of tools, but a lot of times we need to go past that, and I'll show a few examples of where we've extended and utilized this function to go beyond that. Not only that, it allows us to, one of the things I like about it is it allows me to sort of create a central repository of all my functions, and I can easily reuse those across surveys without having to copy and paste a single file. I can store my code in a GitHub repository, for example, develop it and work on it separately, and then bring that into other forms as I grow them out. So I can allow that sharing of code across there. And then being able to bring in those additional libraries and being able to show those as we go forward is also very great. And then being able to bundle them and show that going forward. So now what I want to do is kind of start walking through how we go about some of this. So I want to show a little bit about, Ishmael started showing some ways we can build those functions, but I want to kind of build on that and show a few different ways that we can extend that functionality and link it. And then I'll show a quick way that we link those forms to our build environments so we can show how to share across those different components. A little bit about configuring the development environment. For this one, I'll be using Visual Studio Code, but any IDE will do that you work within Webpack, Sublime, Atom, any of the other ones that you need to be able to do. And then I'll show a few examples of bringing in some third-party libraries and then building out some complex logic inside the code as well. So let me go ahead and hop out to my control here. So to get started a little bit, so I wanted to show a little bit of some code that we'll share towards the end as well. But we have a GitHub repository that has a lot of this function and component set up along with some samples that I'll be showing here. So we can go through, and this will walk you through a lot of what I'm going to be talking about today, of how to get everything set up and how to go through the environment to be able to get it set up. If you're not familiar with Webpack, there's some great documentation on the Webpack site that will sort of walk you through some of the basics that we're doing. A lot of what we do here is a very small amount of what Webpack can actually do, because really we're just going to be bundling up our JavaScript files. We don't get into any of the CSS, JPEGs, or any of the other things that Webpack can do. But there is a large volume of what it can do to simply just write your code and bundle it. So let's step into our Visual Studio Code and begin to actually kind of look at the structure of what we're putting together. So in this case here, we have our Visual Studio Code, and we've built together, as I said, I've already installed this and downloaded it from the GitHub, and I've already installed my node modules. So in this case, these node modules are essentially allow me to bring in that additional functionality that goes far above and beyond what the standard JavaScript library that ships with Survey123 will include. And so it'll allow me to build out these more complicated functions, and more importantly, bundle it up into some other locations. One of the things we also include in here is there are some standard things that the JavaScript library here doesn't quite include, and so we've included a series of polyfills that allow us to actually, get to our console objects and get to some and the promise objects, and so being able to bring those in as well as polyfills so they get utilized by all of the JavaScript libraries. That's kind of an important part of being able to do it, is including these components in there and ready to go. And last, in the Webpack, we set up our configuration file. So this essentially tells our configuration what to build, where to build it, and how we kind of want it to build. So really, we're going to build our index.js, and we'll walk through this here in just a second, into one single pack called mylibrary.js, and we're going to build it out into a common location here at webpack.js/scripts. And we're going to build the library called myLibrary. And so if I go ahead and just run my build script here, it's going to go through and create a Webpack for my scripts. So if I come up here and look in my Finder window, oops. So in here, so I've built out my Survey123 Webpack.js with the scripts, and I just built this library file. You can see it just built here at 1021. So as Ishmael was showing in Survey123, I have my libraries here with the scripts, and right now I don't have any scripts in here, but I don't want to have to copy and paste that script every time I build it in this Webpack and share it over there. So what I can do is I can actually create a symbolic link over to that file. And Windows does a similar thing with shortcuts and everything like that. So here I can just, from this location, create a link to my library.js here. And now once I create that and come back to my scripts window for Survey123, you'll notice I now have my library file available here and ready to go. And so if I come back and start taking a look at my forms, I can actually come in and I've built out a simple Survey123 form with some components in it. And so the first step here is I have this little just debugging and output window that I like to utilize when I'm testing things along the way. So I can actually type in some simple JavaScript functions and be able to actually output the content of those. And I'll walk. So if I go through here, so it just basically terminaled out my logic here. So that allows me to troubleshoot and go through a lot of that component. So now what I want to do is step through. So as Ishmael showed, a little bit of a hello world. Right now, I don't have a function in here called hello world, but I'm going to actually go ahead and add it in and build it in my function. So if I come to my index.js file, you'll see here I have a series of functions that I can include. I have one called getConsole that I just utilized a second ago, but now I'm going to create one called hello world. And same as Ishmael was saying earlier, if you don't need to do it in a function, I would avoid it, but sometimes you can. Okay, so here I can go ahead and save. Oops, sorry. So here I created a function called hello world. It's just a simple array of languages, and I can save it. So now if I save this file and simply run my build again, it's ran through the Webpack and built that file. And if I switch back to Survey123, now you'll notice if I select language, it's going to give me my hello world for that. I haven't added logic for these other ones, but to show how quickly we can just update this, I can add in the additional languages into my array. And so I now have a larger array with these. Save this file, rebuild my Webpack, and switch back to my form. Now for each of these languages, it will print out based on that array. So really quick, easy way to be able to keep that. And like I said, this is a central location and we can easily go through from there. And if we just look at the Excel, this is discussing what Ishmael was hitting on earlier. It's really just, in this case, a pull data from, and in this case, you'll notice one little parameter that we add differently. So the mylibrary.helloworld. So when you're using the Webpack, you have to name the variable as well. And then I simply pass in the form language that the user selected up here and return that language. So now I'm going to go into a slightly different step here. I'm going to add a fetch. So Ishmael had showed how to query out some additional logic, but I want to be able to use some of the more JavaScript-like functions of the fetch and the sync and really minimize down how I do my query. So in this case, I'm just going to do a fetch test, and I have a form over there where I pass in a URL, the field I want to query, any wheres, and pass in a token that the user needs to send if this is a secure service. So I can essentially build my query string, log it, and then get the information out of it. So I'm going to save this fetch. Run this, it'll run through my Webpack and build that out. If I come back and look at my Survey123 form here, so I've built a token where I'm going to do a pull data and get the token for that particular user. I'm going to do a calculate where I go and run this fetch test. I'm going to give it the URL I want, the field I want to query, and then an ISO code that the user's entered here. Once I get that back, I'm going to get essentially in this calculate that feature, and I'm going to parse the JSON out of it and get the long name out of it, and then I can log the data if I want. So if I come here to my form, so here in fetch test, you'll notice that I've entered in USA, I get the long code back from that query. If I change this calculation here to Mexico, for example, so I start getting that country name back, so I can utilize that data in there as well. And so I get back any of those information that's available to me. So if I recalculate that there, so I get the long country name for any of those ISO codes based on that fetch. So using this fetch method just allows us to, as I said, sort of utilize the promise and the JavaScript functionality a little bit more than sometimes the XML HTTP requests can get a little difficult to use. And so I like to use these functions as well. So one of the next things I want to be able to show is actually now being able to bring in a third-party library. So we had a client come up that wanted to be able to write custom projections while they were out in the field. And rather than try to write that in our own JavaScript or any of our own libraries, there's a open source library, Proj4GIS, that allows us to do these really advanced geographic calculations and transformations while you're in the field. So being able to use this simply by doing an npm install. So if I come down here to my code here, I can simply come in and install this library. I've actually already installed it, but so if I come in and just do an npm install, it's going to go out and fetch that library and bundle it up with my particular library. So now if you'll notice in my node modules, there's a lot of them, but I have a library here called Proj4 and Proj4GIS. So I have these libraries that this included that can now be bundled into my environment. And so to access them, I simply need to include a link to those up here in my file. So now I'm importing those modules in, and then I'm going to add a new function in here that actually calls that. So I'm going to copy in a new function here that allows me to export or actually reproject this point on the fly. So here I'm going to pass in the coordinates from anywhere I click on the map, do a little bit of parsing on those coordinates, and then using from the ProjGIS library, there's a specific form I wanted to be able to transform this into, and then reproject it, and then pass it back out in JSON to my end client. So I'm going to go ahead and save this file and rerun my script. And so if I come back here to my form, I now have a section here on Proj4JS. So you'll notice here on my form, if I click anywhere on my map and change my point location, I will automatically get these reprojected points into the Indian South UTM Zone 48, which was a specific project they wanted to be able to do. So a really simple library for doing a very complex thing that we didn't have to redo or reutilize. And one more function I want to be able to show is once again another third-party library, but it starts to get even more complicated and utilizes some of the logic within the repeats and some of the other functionality that we have available within the projects. So I'm going to come in here, and now we have this one. I have a repeat of a couple of polygons, and I'm going to utilize this library called TurfJS, which is a geospatial engine that allows us to do a lot of really complicated geometry with JSON files and with some other data to be able to parse this data and utilize it. What this client wanted to be able to do was be able to calculate a centroid between a group of polygons. And so we wanted to be, and to do it offline and to do it while they were out in the field collecting data to essentially collect a project location based on the centroid of these polygons. So if I come in here to my Visual Studio, I've actually already installed some libraries, but I'm going to actually add some helpers in here and import my files. So up at the top here, I'm going to go ahead and import some of my helper functions that I need to do for these turf modules. And so I have a series of functions here that I'm going to copy in. Now, one of the things about this is you'll notice I have a couple of functions here where I don't explicitly say export. These can't be called by the Survey123, but I can use them inside this JavaScript library to help out with other stuff. And so really here, this function that I'm going to use is a get centroid. I'm going to pass it in a group of polygons that I get from my repeat values. And then I have to do some parsing of that and recreate it. I group those polygons together. So I create a group of these polygons into one large polygon. At that point, I then get the centroid of it, and then I send it back to Survey123 and create a geopoint from that. So if I go ahead and save this, run my script, so it's going to build this out for me, and come back to my Survey123. Let's just make this full screen. So now here I have this polygons area, so I'm going to go in and create an initial polygon. So here I'm just going to draw a polygon around here. And so when I come back to my map, you'll notice that it's created a polygon, but using that logic in the background, it actually generated a centroid on that polygon for me right over where I created that polygon. Now, if I come in and add a second polygon, so let's slide over here a little bit and create another polygon. It's now grouped those two polygons together and created the centroid in between them for me while I'm out in the field. And so that, utilizing those third-party libraries allows us to bring in a lot of that really advanced logic that would be difficult to do, obviously, in an XLS form, even in standard JavaScript, because somebody's already written it and we already have that content available for us. So that's a walkthrough on how we leverage Webpack to be able to bundle up our logic and go through it. So just as a quick last little bit here, you'll notice now in my scripts library that Ishmael was showing, I now have this my library.js. If I open it, when Ishmael opened his, you'll notice you notice that it was readable text, but in the bundled form, it includes all of the logic you need. So there's, you don't directly edit it here, but it contains all of that logic just directly in your form as well. So on this, I'll share out, and these slides will be made available to everybody, but we do have that GitHub repository that shows the Survey123 with Webpack and how to leverage it. We did a developer tech session as well that dives a little bit deeper into some of these components and a little bit more of how to set up the IDE and a few things there. And then further learning on the Webpack JS itself. So with that, Amy?
Yes, thank you, Travis. We're going to now begin answering the questions submitted during today's presentation. We've received quite a few, and we will get through as many as possible, but whatever we do not get to today, we will address in an Esri community blog post after this webinar. As a reminder, you can still submit questions through the questions pane in your attendee control panel. Ismail is going to lead the questions and answers. Go ahead, Ismail.
Thank you, Amy. I was going through the questions. Number one by far was, can I run my custom JavaScript functions in a public survey? The answer is no. People were asking, will I ever be able to do it? The answer right now is no. In the Survey123 team, we have, I would say, exhausted all conversations, all possibilities with the security team at Esri. And it was made crystal clear that it's a security risk to enable custom JavaScript functions in public surveys. Now, having said this, What do we do now? I think that in many cases, you want to use custom JavaScript functions to do things like, I want to do a pointing Polygon query. I want to know what was the last value entered by this user, or when the user last made an entry in the feature layer. I mean, there are some very specific things and common things that you want to use JavaScript for. So the thinking here is we need to get clarity on what these specific things are, because we in the Survey123 team could extend the PullData function to allow you to do these things. For example, what if we do PullData at feature layer? And then we let you say, this is my feature layer, this is the where statement I want to apply, this is the spatial relationship I want to apply. You know what I mean? So it will do what a custom JavaScript function would do, but without you writing the code. You would be using the XLS form syntax. Will this solve every different workflow? No. But if we can solve most of them, I think we all win. So yeah, we need to work together and figure out, what these common things are to see if we can extend PullData to do it. Then there were other questions here, so allow me here, Travis, to go through some of them. We can see people are already saying what is important to you, so please, just add your notes in here. Yeah, there were questions as well, like exceptions, like I have ArcGIS Hub. If I have ArcGIS Hub, will you allow the execution of JavaScript functions for people from the community organization? It's a different organization, but it's strictly linked. It collaborates with the parent org, and right now the answer is no. I think we could probably look at ways to do that, but right now the answer is no. That is not possible. There were also interesting questions about, when should I use a webhook versus when I should use a JavaScript function. So the way I look at this, I'll try to answer this first, Travis. Maybe you can add your thoughts into this since you have so much experience. So in my view, when JavaScript, well, JavaScript executes while the user is completing the form. So if you require sort of a warning to pop up or a constraint to execute right while the form is being completed, that's JavaScript. It's not a webhook, because the webhook only executes once the data is sent. So immediate feedback, JavaScript. A task to be executed after the survey is sent, that will be a webhook. Now, there are situations where you can use JavaScript. We mentioned some limitations, but on top of the public versus private, there are situations like, well, sometimes you want to use a web service to enrich your data, to do some validations, but you can't you cannot if you are working offline. So in this case, JavaScript is not going to cut it, right? Because the JavaScript will run while the user is offline, and then if you are wanting to call a web service, it's not going to work. So in these cases, you have no choice but to use a webhook and maybe send a notification back to the user. That would be an exception. That's what comes to mind first, Travis. I'm not sure if you have any other thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think that sounded about right. And I mean, the main thing with where I think of it is, if you need an immediate feedback, an immediate thing, I tend to always go with the JavaScript function. If you can wait, webhooks work great as well. And so that's where I sort of draw the line on that. And then obviously webhooks, if you need to integrate with other business systems, I wouldn't make a custom JavaScript function that attempts to send an email doing a form. Just there would be some, some differences there that I think would be, something you would want to avoid. So,
right. There is a question here. It says, do you need to have an API key to use JavaScript? Travis?
No, you actually don't need the API key to use the JavaScript functions. They're just, so long as you have access to Survey123 and authoring the form, you don't need the API key. Now, that one step I showed where I was using an Esri token that could utilize an API key in that scenario if you need to get access to those surveys and the user's maybe not logged in or doesn't have quite access to that right spot. You could utilize an API key, but it's not necessary. No.
Right. Can you write a JavaScript function to push data into a feature service?
Yeah, I think the answer here is like if you put the correct REST API calls in as part of your backend process, you certainly could. Yeah, so you definitely could, because it would be the same idea as querying. You could simply push the data in there as well. So
now you can, but should you?
I wouldn't recommend it. No. Given that you're already doing an editing scenario, I would struggle to think of what the logic would need to be for editing a feature while you're in the field like that, or while you're utilizing a survey like that. I'd have to really see what the logic would be for that.
Right. How do you assign, this is a question from Catherine, how do you assign a preferred IDE to use with Survey123 Connect when you click on that external editor?
So in this case on a Mac, I mean, it's essentially the open with type scenario. In this case, I have it already assigned to that, but just basically assign like your JavaScript files to whatever IDE you want to be your default. And that should be, that would be fine. And that'll work within Survey123 Connect. When you essentially assign that, it should open your JavaScript files with whatever IDE you prefer. And I really like using Visual Studio Code for this, but like I said, depending on whatever other ones you're using, those all work as well. So
Giovanni is asking if you could show once more the survey folder structure so he can see where the scripts folder is.
And I am sharing my screen now, right?
You are.
I think I hit pause a second ago. Sorry, I gotta find the right window here. So here, so I have this Survey123 form, and I'll show it from the directory structure here. So in my survey designs, I have my actual survey, and then under here, I have all of the survey components that get built out. And in this scenario, I have a scripts folder that gets, whatever functions are available here. As Ismail showed, you can, this is my Webpack one. I could add other ones in here as well that don't require Webpack. And they could all be included in there, and any other media or there other objects that get included there. So
can you add more than one JavaScript file in the scripts folder?
Yes, you can have as many as you want. You could break it down into discrete functions, similar to what I did here. There's a bunch of functions in here that are doing it. I could break these out into individual files and create functions for each of those as well. So
can you use subfolders to organize logically your JS files in there?
I don't believe so. That's actually a question for you, but I don't believe so. Okay. I've never tried it, but.
Okay, I guess you would probably recommend maybe using Webpack to kind of keep everything.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, there are questions like Shelly is asking, can you show a calculation using JavaScript, using an enter number and a repeat? So, I'm just redirecting people to some of the blogs that we have written and the samples, because that's the best, better than looking at this in the screen very quickly. There are samples in the blogs and things, so I'm pasting the links in there. And then we only have 3 more minutes, right, Amy?
We have 6.
6 minutes, okay. So I'm just trying to see if there are any additional questions here. This one is interesting, Travis. This is for you. Can you utilize async calls if you bundle it through jQuery?
Survey123 requires all the calls to be synchronous. So while you can sort of simulate that idea, it still is a synchronous call in there, because even if here in the fetch test, like where I have it, while it's going out and getting it, it won't wait. Like, it's not going to do an await and stop and pause here. Like, it will just simply go execute that call right away and bring it back. So at this point, like, asynchronous, not fully implementable at this point because of how Survey123 is wants it back in a synchronous fashion.
Okay. Christina is asking, is there a list of resources available that Travis is referencing?
I believe we'll make all the slides available, and probably as part of the blog post, we'll have all of those resources listed out in there as well.
Interesting question from Matt. Can you access secure services out of the box using Survey123, or do you need custom JavaScript with token fetch?
So from like map services, like if you're going to access them in any sort of a query function, you would need that token to fetch it. But there's the feature service question request now, right? That allows the users to do that. That should work as well. So if you're just querying that, yeah.
Yeah, like the logic in your JavaScript is never going to automatically pass in a token to the feature services you call. You have to do that, like Travis was showing. Now, you can get the token from the currently logged in user using the property PullData function. You can get the token. There is a question also about, can I use a custom JavaScript function to populate a list in a select one or select multiple? Let me take this one, Travis. So the answer is no. The PullData function is not going to help you populate a list. However, right now in beta, we have new appearance called search. It's part of the XLS form specification. And it allows you to dynamically populate a list, select one or select multiple, from a feature layer query. You can do attribute queries, you can do spatial queries, and then populate the list. This is in beta, so we would appreciate your feedback. In fact, I pasted the answer kind of in the Q&A section so you can see the link. And our plan is to release these officially in 3.13, which is going to be, I think, September, October, our next update, which we originally had plans to release in July, then was pushed to August. Now we are pushing back a little bit more. We are struggling with a few things, so that's when we will make it available.
All right. Well, thank you, Ismail, Travis, and thank you, everyone, for attending today's webinar, working with custom JavaScript functions in ArcGIS Survey123 forms. If you have any other questions, please feel free to contact me using my email address in the follow-up email that you will be receiving after this webinar. Once you leave today, you will also be receiving a survey on the presentation in that email, and we would appreciate it if you would complete that and provide your feedback. We will also be providing a recording of this presentation. It will be available within 7 to 10 business days on our GeoDev webinar landing page. On behalf of Esri and our presenters, thank you for joining us today, and have a great rest of your day.